All right, so it's an honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Aldon Morris, who is a professor emeritus of sociology at Northwestern University. Morris is the author of the award-winning book, The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, and he is also the co-editor of Frontiers in Social Movement Theory and Opposition Consciousness. He has published widely on a variety of topics, notably his book, The Scholar Denied, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Birth of Modern Sociology, continues to exert significant influence in sociology and the social sciences, both nationally and internationally. It has challenged sociologists to rethink the canon and how they teach sociology, especially sociological theory and methodology. Morris is also a former chair of sociology, director of Asian American Studies, and the interim dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northwestern University. Moreover, Morris is the member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the former president of the American Sociological Association. Please join me in welcoming Professor Aldon Morris.
Good morning. I'm a little puzzled because I thought I was scheduled for 9:30, and so I've never had the opportunity to go earlier than when I was scheduled to go. But be that as it may, let me try to get things situated here so it'll work right. All right. So first of all, I am honored to be here, at this important conference, to reflect on Du Bois's legacy and its implication for the pursuit of social justice. I want to thank Brown University scholars who conceived and organized this important conference. I thank Professor Sandra Barnes for inviting me, and I thank Dr. Julian Culver for navigating my visit. I'm also so very pleased to be able to interact with numerous colleagues and friends. Now, it is essential to first present a discussion of the social conditions that produced W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was raised in poverty and endured racism. He was a first-generation high school and college student. His background, therefore, contrasted sharply with Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber. And because they grew up in the upper reaches of white European empires where they received abundant privileges, including elite educations. Small wonder, then, that Du Bois's perspective differed radically from Marx, from Weber, from Durkheim, and from white European and American scholars generally. Du Bois was raised by a single mother. His mother, Mary Sylvania Burkhart, worked as a domestic in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, cooking and scrubbing floors of white families. Du Bois's Haitian father, Alfred Du Bois, deserted the family without a trace when W.E.B. Du Bois was a toddler. Perhaps Daddy was a Rolling Stone. Because Du Bois and his mother were poor, the two of them, struggled to keep their family intact. As a teenager, Du Bois contributed to the household by working odd jobs. Their poverty was exacerbated when Du Bois's mother suffered a stroke. which left her unable to work. Du Bois described how he and his mother shouldered poverty. Quote, "We were companions, and even when she was lame from overwork and worry, we walked out happily, arm in arm. She bore the burden of our poverty with a smile," end quote. Du Bois's mother died in 1885, shortly after her 16-year-old son graduated from high school. Though he was superbly gifted academically, Du Bois did not have money to attend college. Several local white churches raised the money to send Du Bois to Fisk University in Tennessee. There, Du Bois confronted the Jim Crow regime. He rode in the rear of buses and trains. That famous line, "To know Jim Crow is to ride Jim Crow." So he rode in the rear of buses and trains, endured daily insults, and learned of lynchings nearby. During this moment, Du Bois dedicated his life to working to achieve Black liberation by becoming an active organizer. I'm going to go back. I'll just leave it there. I don't want to keep this too early in the morning to keep looking at those lynchings. So during this moment, Du Bois dedicated his life to working to achieve Black liberation by becoming an active organizer of an already vibrant, agency-bearing Black community. So, colleagues, we are here today because Du Bois kept that promise to work all his life for Black and human liberation. Now, we are amid the flowering of Du Bois sociology. Du Bois developed numerous ideas that laid the foundation for a brand of sociology and social science. Those ideas included the identification and interrogation of the worldwide color lines that structured global racial inequality, focused attention on the color line, predicting that it would be the problem of the 20th century, pioneered American scientific sociology by utilizing multiple empirical methodologies and grounded theorizing, formulated the thesis that races were social constructions by which racial hierarchies were built to facilitate racial exploitation, demonstrated that all races were equal because racial inequality rested on biological and cultural myths of superior and inferior races, and developed an innovative Marxist theory identifying the significance of class, race, and gender interactions, demonstrated that institutions like global racism, that is the slave trade, slavery, colonization, were foundational to the rise of capitalist modernity, demonstrated that human agency among the oppressed was an ever powerful social force that shaped and made history, captured the complex inner lives of African descendants through his concept of double consciousness, produced politically engaged social science that provided knowledge guiding liberation movements. So then, these analytical and political considerations were not central to the development of modern European and American social sciences. Because of their erasure, mainstream social science presented an incomplete and misleading picture of modernity. However, a change is apparent. Du Boisian social science has emerged, generating hundreds, perhaps thousands of books and articles on Du Bois's scholarship and activism. Du Boisian scholarship is expanding in breadth and depth so rapidly that it's becoming difficult to track and to absorb. Recent foundational texts have boosted this explosion, including Earl Wright's articles in the 2000s and his 2016 book, The First American School of Sociology, Aldon Morris's 2015 book, The Scholar Denied, Jose Itzigzong and Corita Brown's 2020 book, The Sociology of W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Hunter's 2013 article, A Bridge Over Troubled Waters. So then numerous subfields are claiming Du Bois as one of their own, including economic, environmental, and global sociology, gender, race, and ethnic studies, methodology, demography, and medical sociology, historical and comparative studies, criminology, and political sociology, symbolic interaction and the sociology of emotions, and sociological theory. You know, many of these specialties are now claiming Du Bois as one of their founders. International journals are publishing symposia on Du Bois's work. Numerous countries are sponsoring lectures and conferences on Du Bois. Handbooks on Du Bois are appearing. So as you can see, let me put it like this. One of those handbooks is the Oxford Handbook of W.E.B. Du Bois, which will appear later this year, I believe in November. This particular handbook covers like 50 chapters on all aspects of Du Bois's life, work, and activism, just to give you a quick kind of view of what's in it. So hopefully, as you can see, that many works have been published now and are under work on Du Bois, constituting what we proudly call Du Boisian sociology. That handbook that I just showed, it is designed to analyze and unpack Du Bois's contribution as a scholar activist who explored the depths of human oppression and methods of the oppressed which they can use to try and overthrow such wretched predicament. When this paradigm started taking root and I started thinking about it, I decided right before this conference that I would ask 20, not 20, but it ended up being 20 Du Boisian sociologists to reflect on how they came to Du Bois and to Du Boisian sociology. So here's a sample of what they said. So Professor Zini Magabon related, quote, "When I started my PhD in sociology at Harvard, Du Bois was never mentioned, not once, in any of my seminars at Harvard. He was completely ignored," end quote. Magabon's father introduced her to Du Bois through his library collection. Quote, "My father, a professor at UConn, had a huge library, and every single thing Du Bois ever wrote was in the house," end quote. Professor Cheryl Gilks' father introduced her to Du Bois. Quote, "My father was a Morehouse College graduate who had seen and heard Du Bois in person. And so he made it his mission to plant a consciousness in me of Du Bois as a child. We played a game where he would stand over me and ask playfully and loudly, 'What's the word?' She would respond loudly and proudly, 'Du Bois, Daddy. Du Bois. Du Bois. Du Bois,' end quote. Earl Wright, his grandparents introduced him to Du Bois, quote, As a youth, I spent time living in my grandparents' home. They had a bookshelf filled with lots and lots of books. It was at my grandparents' house that I remember as a child being enthralled by a book with a controversial title and a funny name for the author. That book was The Philadelphia Negro by W.E.B. Du Bois, end quote. Professor Jose Itzigzong explained, quote, I finished my PhD without reading Du Bois or even knowing who he was. My first job was as a teaching postdoc at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I learned that its main library was named the W.E.B. Du Bois Library. This piqued my curiosity about who Du Bois was. I started reading his works, learning about the man himself, and trying to fill the gaps in my education, end quote. Professor Michael Verwey related, quote, when I was in Africa, I don't remember ever hearing of Du Bois. William Julius Wilson's syllabus for his race course in 1972 did not have anything by Du Bois. By the way, a little side thing. I've always been interested how generations of black sociologists, there are exceptions, before this period did not discuss and include Du Bois as part of their sociology. So Burway says, so I had to wait until 2016 when I invited Aldon to present the Scholar Denied in our Berkeley Sociology Forum before I became immersed in Du Bois's work. Professor Jennifer Carrera explained, quote, my exposure to Du Bois in graduate school was very limited. I started a deeper dive into Du Bois when I read Marcus Hunter's A Bridge Over Troubled Waters. Professor Melissa Weiner responded, quote, I first read Du Bois on my own as a newly declared sociology undergraduate at Boston University. Unfortunately, I was never assigned Du Bois in any course I took at any level, end quote. Jordan Conwell says, quote, any story of how I find myself doing research within Du Boisian sociology starts with having the good fortune of taking Aldon's Du Bois graduate seminar about 10 years ago as he was working on the Scholar Denied, end quote. Professor Li Day of China related that, quote, when I arrived at Princeton University, the department held a reception for all the first year PhD students, plus me, the first visiting Chinese PhD student. At the reception, I was told about a talk given by Aldon at Harvard on the Scholar Denied that showcased the problem minority scholars face in academia. The story resonated with me, end quote. Finally, Professor Marcus Hunter conveyed, quote, it is often said, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. One day in 2004, it happened. Dr. Du Bois stood before me. For a year, I prayed whether to teach in the Philly School District for another year or apply to graduate school. And just as the anxiety approached fever pitch, somewhere between vision, presence, and a daydream, Du Bois stood before me with open hands outreached, end quote. So then, most of these Du Boisian scholars were not introduced to Du Bois through university curricula. Rather, that introduction came from family members, from a scholar discovering a library named for Du Bois, from scholars who read Du Bois on their own, and from young scholars who encountered Du Bois finally in the seminar room. And it seems Du Bois may even appear through divine intervention. Intellectual disgust with mainstream scholarship motivated these scholars, especially those from oppressed communities, to seek out Du Bois. Wright was troubled, Earl Wright was troubled that only white sociologists were credited with pioneering urban sociology. He knew Du Bois was that pioneer and that his scholarship championed black liberation. Magabon was disturbed that her Harvard class on political revolutions did not consider the Haitian Revolution and never mentioned Du Bois. Its own hungered for critical analysis of racialized modernity. Bois was challenged to include race issues in his theory class. Reyes was angered because critical black economic sociologists were erased from her field. Carrera, an environmental sociologist, was disturbed because her field was dominated by Marxist perspectives that reduced race issues to class. Weiner was disappointed that there were few works on blacks from the black perspective. Day, that is the Chinese scholar, was disappointed because imported U.S. sociology did not help Chinese grapple with crucial issues they face. Loughran experienced frustration with the lack of rigorous engagement with Du Bois. Clearly, Du Bois was the scholar denied. Nevertheless, Du Bois and scholars discovered and rediscovered Du Bois and transmitted the discovery to younger generations who are deriving intellectual delight from the discovery. When Magabon's father gifted her Du Bois's article titled Africa and the French Revolution, quote, "It completely changed how I thought about everything." Du Bois's work demonstrated what was missing in mainstream sociology. And it is the key that unlocks not only the colonial history of our discipline, but also provides the tools to make the discipline, to remake the discipline, end quote. For Fred Weary, Du Bois, quote, took existing and new data and combined them with the arts to tell a dignified and dignifying story about the lives of black folk in America, end quote. Thus, he continues that these insights emerge from taking today's problems and seeing them with fresh eyes through Du Boisian visualizations, end quote. Professor Ricardo Hammer, she's from this department. She said she grew up in Austria, admiring the accomplishments of European cities embellished by European scholars. But after she read Du Bois and other scholars in the black radical tradition, quote, "I never walked in Europe's metropole with the same eyes ever again. Everywhere were the traces of the colonial project, racial slavery, and violence. I began to find the European discourse on immigration reprehensible," end quote. Du Boisian sociology has rejuvenated the intellectual energy of some of us old senior scholars. Bois concluded, quote, "So for the last 8 years, I've devoted myself to Du Bois, his writings, to biographies and discussions of his work. It has been inspiring and rejuvenating to treat his writings as a field site when I'm beyond working in factories, even beyond working the university factory," end quote. Its exon summarized the promise of the new enterprise, that is, Du Boisian sociology, quote, "It's a path that leads to a sociology that is rooted in history and conjunctural analysis, a sociology that is global and that looks at the world critically from many margins. In short, it's a sociology that is very different and much better sociology than mainstream sociology," end quote. Hence, Du Bois is no longer a scholar denied. Rather, his ideas fuel Du Boisian scholarship and enhance collective efforts to build a vigorous, rich, and publicly engaged social science. Surprise, surprise. Not all social scientists are pleased with Du Boisian sociology. Jeff Goodwin, a Marxist sociologist, recently launched a critique against Du Boisian sociology focused specifically on Itzig Zong and Brown's book, but making clear his target is Du Boisian sociology as a whole. For him, Du Boisian sociology is not unique, and by failing to acknowledge, he says, Du Bois's adoption of Marxism, it actually does Du Bois a disservice. Now, I'm going to spend considerable time here rebutting this indictment because too many scholars might find it persuasive in the absence of a clear understanding of the difference between the late Du Bois and the ideological position that Goodwin attributes to him. I also want to say that I'm building on the debate between Jose Itzig Zong and Goodwin. They've gone back and forth, and my critique that is coming builds off of Jose Itzig Zong's reply to him. Moreover, the reason why I'm going to bother you going through Goodwin's claims is that because it provides me an opportunity to clearly state Du Bois's understanding of how and why racism was a material foundation for the rise and survival of capitalism. And it provides me the opportunity to flush out Du Bois's enormous contributions to social science. Goodwin argues that in the 1930s, Du Bois replaced his race-centric theoretical perspective with a Marxist perspective. For Goodwin, this new Marxist perspective led Du Bois to realize that race and racism were not independent forces, and that race and racism played no causal role in developing modernity and capitalism. Rather, for him, race was merely an ideology that rationalized and legitimized social oppression, racial oppression, that is. Goodwin further argues that Du Bois, as a Marxist, came to understand that it was societal's economic foundation, that is, capitalist economic relations, that was the sole causal factor that produced and sustained modernity. Race and racism were simply consequences of capitalist relations constructed by the capitalist class to exploit the working class. Hence, this is my characterization of his argument, hence it is futile to waste theoretical time fiddling with race as if it were an independent causal force. Racial oppression, in this view, can only be eradicated through class struggle, where eventually the working class would overthrow the bourgeoisie. Once this happened, the cancer of racism would be starved of its economic lifeline and perish. 30 years, it is true that 30 years after embracing Marxist theoretical principles, a 91-year-old Du Bois joined the Communist Party and to work there to help realize the dream of human emancipation through a successful communist revolution. Goodwin claims Du Boisian sociology denied and erased the late Du Bois's Marxist sociology because this allows us to align Du Bois with our liberal and conservative politics. Du Boisian sociology therefore removed all taints, it is argued, of communism from Du Bois's sociology, because we are afraid that embracing his Marxism will alienate the liberals we wish to win over. Goodwin concludes that this erasure of the late Du Bois results in a portrait of Du Bois as continuing to embrace a race-centric theory of capitalism, when in fact the late Du Bois had adopted a class-centered theory. This outdated and inaccurate race perspective is thus the erroneous foundation which undermines the viability of Du Boisian sociology as a whole. For Goodwin, the race-centered perspective is a theoretical dinosaur because after 1935, Du Bois' sociology is just really Marxism. Thus, if Du Boisian sociology were to embrace the real Marxist Du Bois, their intellectual house would collapse, since the race-based argument lies at its foundation. So then, let's dig deep into Goodwin's argument and assess its viability. The first issue is whether Du Bois accepted Marxism as Marx formulated it. Goodwin claims that Du Bois was not a critic of Marxism and that he never modified it. Yet, firsthand evidence from Du Bois's mouth contradicts Goodwin. Du Bois proclaims, quote, "It was a great loss to the American Negroes that the great mind of Marx and his extraordinary insight into industrial conditions could not have been brought to bear at first hand upon the history of the American Negro. Whatever he said and did concerning the uplift of the working class must, therefore, be modified so far as Negroes are concerned by the fact that Marx had not studied at first hand their peculiar race problems here in America," end quote. On another occasion, Du Bois concluded, "What shall we, quote, what shall we say of the Marxian philosophy and of its relation to the American Negro? We can only say the Marxian philosophy is a true diagnosis of the situation in Europe in the middle of the 19th century, but it must be modified in the United States of America, and especially so far as the Negro group is concerned," end quote. Now, Goodwin identified Will Herberg as the young white communist who mentored Du Bois in Marxism. But Goodwin fails to mention Du Bois's discussion with Herberg, where Du Bois expressed differences with both Marx and Herberg. Du Bois informed Herberg that, quote, "With regard to the Negro bourgeoisie, our differences is simply a question of fact. Over a period of 30 years, I have visited Negroes in every state of the Union, and I suppose I have a wider personal acquaintance with them than most living persons," end quote. But he continues, quote, "The differences between us," that is, between he and Herberg, "is this. You believe quite sincerely that a realization on the part of white workers of their class interests as opposed to white capital is going to make them rise above racial antipathy. I do not believe it. I believe that race hate persists in the United States, even when the lines of the class struggle are closely defined," end quote. When Herberg encouraged Du Bois to publish his differences with Marx on the question of race and class, Du Bois responded, quote, "This is exactly what I'm going to undertake in my next article. I'm going to try and ask what modifications in the doctrine must be made to suit the peculiar situation of the Negro in America." Du Bois continues, "I hesitate, however, to write this because, as you know even better than I, the more one studies Marx, the more one is astounded at his tremendous knowledge and depth of thought. And I'm afraid that anything I may say might easily be modified when I know more," end quote. Despite Du Bois's reluctance, he published this article, as well as others documenting his modifications of Marxism. Therefore, Du Bois did not uncritically accept anyone's what might be called Du Bois's friendly amendment to Marxist theory. Du Bois formulated a different view of the origins of capitalism than Marx. For Marx, slave societies presented insurmountable barriers to the rise of capitalism because they generated a primitive form of accumulation. Slave societies therefore constituted a prehistory before capitalism because workers were not free to sell their labor power to capitalists. And so Marx argued, quote, the present struggle, talking about the Civil War, the present struggle between the South and the North is therefore nothing but a struggle between two social systems, the system of slavery and the system of free labor. The struggle has broken out because the two systems can no longer live peacefully side by side on the North American continent, end quote. In contrast, for Du Bois, slave societies and colonized societies were crucial conduits, giving rise to capitalism, thus constituting the foundation on which capitalism was built. Du Bois insisted, quote, the Negro race has been the foundation upon which the capitalist system has been reared. The Industrial Revolution carried through and imperial colonialism established. America became, through African labor, the center of the sugar empire and the cotton kingdom, and an integral part of that world history and trade which caused the Industrial Revolution and the reign of capitalism, end quote. For Marx, the working class as a whole generated the surplus value that distinguished capitalist societies from all others. Du Bois modified and somewhat disagreed, arguing that racism generated a disproportionate share of the surplus value that drove the capitalist system. Quote, this is Du Bois, out of the exploitation of the dark proletariat comes the surplus value, which is veiled and concealed, end quote. For Du Bois, imperial colonialism created a gigantic new source of surplus value because, quote, the extension of the world market by imperial expanding of industry has established a worldwide new proletariat of colored workers, end quote. This global black proletariat toiled under the worst conditions of 19th century capitalism and were paid the lowest wages in modern history. Hence, they provided a new mass of material for industry. Du Bois identified the staggering consequences of this development. Quote, with this largesse, the capitalists have consolidated economic power, nullified universal suffrage, and bribed their white workers with high wages, visions of wealth, and opportunity to drive niggas, end quote. Rather than racism providing mere legitimation and rationalization for capitalist exploitation, as Goodwin argues, Du Bois demonstrated how this racist expropriation of surplus value from enslaved and colonized people gave rise to opulent American and European empires. Du Bois differed radically from Goodwin by disputing his claim that the ruling bourgeoisie was responsible for fomenting racism within the working class. Rather, Du Bois identified the racist agency of the white working class that they utilized to oppress black workers. Quote, this is Du Bois, it is not sufficient answer to say that capitalism encourages the oppression and uses it for its own ends. The bulk of American white labor is neither ignorant nor fanatical. It knows exactly what it is doing and meant to do it. They have no excuse of illiteracy or religion to veil their deliberate intention to keep Negroes and Mexicans and other elements of common labor as a lower proletariat who are subservient to their interests as they are to the interests of capital, end quote. So then this active white racism affected class formations because, quote, Du Bois again, this black proletariat is not a part of the white proletariat. They have similar complaints against capitalists, save that the grievances of the Negro worker are more fundamental and indefensible, ranging as they do since the days of Karl Marx, from chattel slavery to the worst paid, sweated, mobbed, and cheated labor in any civilized land, end quote. Black workers did not only then fight a racist, legitimizing ideology, they battled mistreatment and discrimination by white people who believed that blacks did not deserve equality, social equality, because they were inferior. Du Bois further differentiated white workers from black workers by arguing, quote, it must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received their low wage, they were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deferences and titles of courtesy because they were white, end quote. Thus, whites were granted self-esteem at the expense of black people. This was a zero-sum inverse relationship because as whites gained esteem, blacks were denied their self-esteem, leading to their shaming dehumanization. Moreover, black dehumanization was not confined to the work setting because the psychological wage was applied to whites in Jim Crow public settings where blacks deferred to whites, addressing them as sirs and ma'ams, while whites called blacks boys, aunties, and niggas. Rule infraction by blacks attracted violent punishment, including the lynch rope. Unlike Goodwin, Du Bois emphasized the enforcement of black dehumanization far beyond the work setting, far beyond the factory. Quote, I've seen a man, an educated gentleman, grow livid and angry with a little, silent black woman who was sitting by herself in a Pullman's car. He was a white man. I have seen a great grown man curse a little child who had wandered into the wrong waiting room searching for his mother. Here, you damn black. He was white. Merciful God, we have seen right here in America cruelty, barbarism, and murder done to men and women of Negro descent, end quote. So when the analytic attention is restricted to the work setting as largely done by Goodwin, this broad black dehumanization escapes into oblivion. Du Bois was also influenced by Sigmund Freud to study unconscious irrational behavior. And thus, Du Bois probed the Caucasian mind to understand why whites hated blacks fanatically. Following Freud's analysis of the unconscious, Du Bois became convinced that irrational, unconscious forces deep within the white psyche twisted the white mind into racist knots that whites could not escape without extraordinary intervention. For Du Bois, an anti-activist race, quote, must deal not only with conscious, rational action, but with irrational and unconscious habit, long buried in folkways and custom, end quote. Du Bois counseled anti-racist activists to prepare for a long struggle to try to overturn these conditioned reflexes. Thus, irrational forces constituted a foundational pillar of white society where they solidified and reproduced racism. Goodwin dismisses Du Bois's argument regarding psychological wage and unconscious racism, claiming that they were unimportant to Du Bois because he only mentioned them in passing and metaphorically. And thus Goodwin erased Du Bois's most critical contribution to understanding class consciousness. So I conclude stating unequivocally, got to remind you something, I come out of the black church, so when the preacher say he concluded, it means he's halfway. Only, if that. I conclude stating unequivocally that Du Bois remained a race-centric theorist throughout his career, including after his embrace of Marxist theory. Going beyond capitalist economic relations, Du Bois analyzed the meaning for people of color being denied citizenship and political rights. He continuously analyzed societal racism, its relation to power, to racial violence, and racialized dehumanization. Du Bois focused on a racialized modernity, as Zizong and Brown argued, both in market relations and social relations. That is what made Du Bois a race-centered and a Marxist-centered theorist. Throughout Du Bois's career, he focused on the dehumanization blacks suffered at the hands of whites. You know, the thing is, Du Bois knew firsthand the sting of racial insults, the put-downs, and treatment designed to make us feel less than a human being. Goodwin sliced the centrality of dehumanization addressed in Black Reconstruction by largely focusing on the material side of Du Bois's analysis. Yet, in the book's opening page, Du Bois wrote, quote, "In fine, I'm going to tell the story as though Negroes were ordinary human beings, realizing that this attitude will from the first seriously curtail my audience," end quote. In this classic study that is Black Reconstruction, Du Bois made visible Black courage, dignity, and agency, including the discovery that enslaved people freed themselves. Through his elegant and fiery pen, Du Bois sought to restore humanity to a people forced daily to struggle to hold on to shreds of their dignity and self-respect. Throughout his life, Du Bois remained a race theorist because he believed oppressed people of color would liberate humanity. Following his embrace of Marxism, he maintained, quote, "In the heart of Black workers alone lie those ideals of democracy and politics and industry, which may in time make the workers of the world effective dictators of civilization," end quote. For Du Bois, human emancipation would emerge from struggles of people of color because of shared oppression based on skin color. Addressing Black people throughout the world, Du Bois exhorted them to unite with Chinese in collective action to emancipate humanity. This was the optimal strategy for Du Bois because they would do so in unison based on their shared skin color and experiences of racial domination. So then, instead of calling for workers of the world to unite because all they had to lose were their chains, Du Bois thundered to people of color, quote, "China is your flesh of flesh and blood of your blood. China is colored and knows what a colored skin in this modern world subjects its owner," end quote. For Du Bois, the people of color had to break free from actual chains, clinging around their ankles. Instead of summoning the white and Black proletarians to unite, Du Bois declared, quote, "Africa, arise, stand straight, speak and think, act, turn from the West and your slavery and humiliation for the last 500 years and face the rising sun, end quote. So it was from this darker side of the sun that Du Bois believed would come the mobilization and struggle that would achieve human emancipation. This Du Boisian vision is millions of miles apart from the dominant Marxist vision that human liberation will march in on the wings of a unified, deracialized proletarian movement. Thus, Du Bois embraced a race-centric view regarding the final reckoning of the darker races with white workers and the bourgeoisie exploiters. Therefore, Du Bois was a race-centered and a Marxist-centered theorist and activist. So it's time we recognize that Du Bois' scholarship formulated analysis implicating outcome traced to multiple roots of causation. Hence, there is no need to fight over whether Du Bois was a Marxist or a race theorist. He was both. And if we so desire, we can be too. Du Bois' sociology is thriving, but there are no guarantees. Kevin Loughran's observations are instructive. Quote, I have been disheartened when I ask students if they have encountered Du Bois on other syllabi. And the answer is almost always no. He is not brought systematically into one's thinking. Along similar lines, Anahid L. Hardin tells us, quote, I always knew of Du Bois as one of the insert sociologists. However, such inserts seldom tell us much about these important theorists. They, in fact, reinforce their marginality by inserting them only to prove the disciplined, belated attempt at theoretical DEI. So, Du Boisian scholars, our work ahead to unpack the insights of Du Bois and other scholars denied will be challenging indeed. But as Burway reveals, quote, we had a century or more to reconstruct Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. Now we need a century to do the same for Du Bois. Godspeed. So if there's no questions, I can take,
I have a question. Hi, Dr. Morris. Thank you so much for this beautiful talk. As I reflect on Du Bois, one of the things that always sticks out to me is how responsive and reflexive his work is, and how he is always kind of looking for the points of possibility in the moment that, am I speaking loud enough? He's leaning in. Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, great. So like in the beginning of his work, right, where he's seeing segregation and he's seeing Black cooperatives as a point of possibility where Black folks can take advantage of the conditions of segregation to create their own sort of economic opportunities and cooperatives. And later on in his life, as you mentioned, he's looking at the East and China as a point of possibility to take for Black folks in struggles for decolonization and anti-capitalism. And so with that sort of method of looking at the points of possibility, of looking for both the needs and what the current context is, what points of possibility do you think that Du Bois would be getting or wanting us to look more at in this historical, social, cultural moment as folks are fighting for abolition, as folks are trying to end genocides, as folks are like the sort of various political projects that are happening? What sort of points of possibilities do you think Du Bois would want us to turn our attention to?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think that Du Bois would be very disappointed and disheartened by where we are now. It is clear that his belief and his vision about Afro-Asian joining together has not panned out. Zini Magabon was There was a discussion yesterday about this. There was a discussion about the role that China is playing in Africa and other places of color with some, I think, efforts to exploit those lands. I think that one of the things is that we are not here to make Du Bois a saint. Du Bois had blind spots and shortcomings. And I think that he was totally captivated by the Communist Revolution in China, and that he thought that it was the way to the future. He also thought that way about the Soviet Union. And so I think that what the present conditions show us is that he missed the mark on that. But we have to look at him in the context of his time and his moment. And that's the way the world looked to him. Now, what do I think? What do I think Du Bois would point to now? I think the first thing is that he would point to the fact that in many ways, people of color are not standing up for human emancipation and liberation to the degree that ought to be the case. You know, my friends, look at what is happening in Haiti. Haiti was the first country to have a successful overthrow of slavery through a revolution. And it has spiraled into a place of murder, of chaos. What is the nations and black people, colored people around the world doing with regard to Haiti, the birthplace of a successful revolution against slavery? No, we're standing by, and we're letting what is going on there happen largely without any help from us. Not even much thought or criticism about it. Serious murder, even forms of possible genocides happening in many places in Africa. Now, it is true that what is happening in Haiti and what is happening in Africa is a legacy. It's the legacy of colonialism. So what I think that Du Bois would say to us is that we need, once again, to look at our condition collectively. We need to think about how we can mobilize to try and to confront the current situation. And so I know that I am very hurt and disappointed by what I see going on in the world, especially insofar as people of color are concerned. But one of the things that I will say, and that was part of your point, Du Bois continued to evolve in his thinking, and he continued to try to figure out how do you achieve human liberation. And so I think that he would say, do not despair beyond being able to think and to come up with solutions for the problems that exist now. And so I think that both as scholars and as activists, we need to try to find out what kind of strategies, what kind of mobilizations and so forth that we should be involved in to try to achieve liberation right here in the United States and then globally. Yes.
Thank you so much for that beautiful, beautiful talk. I stood up to ask a question precisely because of what you just said at the end, in terms of, I'm also a scholar activist, so I look at those connections as well. And and I'm from the Dominican Republic, and precisely I was thinking about Haiti this morning, thinking about the conference, and before coming here, I was looking at the news, and yeah, it's absolutely terrible what is happening and continues to happen. So I was wondering about what is your take on the possibilities for collaboration between Du Boisian sociologists and similar schools, and I'm thinking, again, because I'm from Latin America, I'm thinking mainly about the decolonial school, right? So what kind of, I don't know, connections, collaborations. Again, I mentioned the decolonial school because of Aníbal Quijano, because of María Lugones, but other schools of thoughts and other people that we can engage doing this work. And of course, doing the connection with activism that Du Bois himself did. And thank you again.
Thank you. I think that there's so much room for cooperation between Du Boisian sociology here and critical sociology in the global South. I recently lectured on Du Bois in Singapore, and many of those scholars there at Nanyang University in Singapore, they engaged in critical global sociology there. They're talking a lot like us about rethinking the canon and what role Du Bois has in that canon. And one of the things that one of the scholars did for me is that he gave me a book on how they are rethinking the canon. And he talks about all kinds of theorists who were sociologists and social scientists that we've never heard of. And as I read that, I was like, my God, this is so interesting. We're talking the same language in a lot of ways, and yet we don't know each other. We don't interact with each other. But as I said early in the talk, Du Bois has started to penetrate Brazil, Cuba, China. There was a conference organized on Du Bois in China just last year. I was a keynote speaker in the conference. And so Du Bois's type of critical sociology is starting to get around the world and in places that are oppressed, who are hungering for knowledge just like us. So what I would say is that, first of all, we need to look very carefully at the critical social science that's happening over the world. Get it, read it, see where the connections are. And because one of the things about Du Bois, early on, it's amazing, early on, he had an international perspective, a true international perspective. I mean, the man studied racism all over the world. I mean, literally studied it. Cuba, Brazil, Soviet Union, China, India, and so on. So I think that one of the challenges ahead for Du Boisian scholars is that we've got to embrace this international perspective and to push Du Boisian or critical ideas all over the world. I think, but we also got to realize that there are others that are doing the same thing that we don't know about and we're not reading. And so we have a lot of work ahead. But yes, I think connecting the scholarship and connecting the activism will be critical as we move forward. Barbara.
So, I do not have a profound question about Du Boisian critical sociology. I want to switch the focus a bit, and it's more personal as to Aldon Morris as a scholar. Most of the presenters have prefaced their talks with how they first encountered Du Bois scholarship and so forth. I'm wondering when you first encountered Du Bois's scholarship, one, but number two, given that we're both graduates of the doctoral program at Northwestern.
I'm not a graduate, I was a professor.
Oh, no, you're Michigan, I'm sorry.
No, I'm not Michigan, I was Stony Brook. I taught
Where?
in Michigan.
Stony Brook? Oh, okay. Okay, I know you teach.
You know who was on my dissertation committee? Patrick Henry.
Oh, okay, all right, wow. Wow, okay, yeah. But my question is about you as a scholar. When you were first introduced to Du Bois, how you developed this long now history of scholarship and interest in Du Boisian critical sociology, and what you might, advice you might give to graduate students in sociology who might be coming out teaching sociology. I know when I'm a graduate of Northwestern in the 70s, and I was only introduced, I had already been introduced to Du Bois in junior college, but at Northwestern in a graduate program, we were required to only deal with Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, the godfathers of sociology. No mention of Du Bois, ever. So what advice might you give also to graduate students who might come out and teach?
You know, thank you. At breakfast, I was in a conversation with three graduate students. And one of the things that I said to them, I was in a conversation at breakfast with three graduate students. Can you hear me? And one of the things I was telling them is that I had the same experience of not being taught Du Bois in grad school. I never read anything by Du Bois. I was never assigned anything by Du Bois. I never had any examination on Du Bois. And I told them, though, our generation has helped change this. And so now, Du Bois is becoming part of the canon, and so they don't have to go through what we went through with this total erasure. At the same time, we have to be, as I said, very clear that we've only begun to scratch the surface. Du Bois wrote so much. And I'm still reading, like for example, in the Macabon quote, where she says that her father gave her this article on Africa in the French Revolution and all. I was like, I never read that. And I went quickly and read it. All I'm saying is that Du Bois was like, he was like Marx and people like that, prodigious intellects and writers and so forth. And so even though Du Bois will be available to you now in the academy, you got to understand that we're just beginning, and it's on you too to keep the torch going, to delve deeply into the work. Me personally, I encountered Du Bois when I was in community college in Chicago. It wasn't about sociology, but it was about the epic struggle between W.E.B. and Booker T. And I read that, and I was like, wow, this is pretty damn interesting. And then when I went to the four-year school to complete my bachelor's and then to graduate school, I just knew that now I could learn about Du Bois in the community college. And I'm going to higher education, and I'm going to really learn now. Never happened. Never happened. But I started to read Du Bois on my own, and I will tell you this. For me, coming out of the Black Power movement, we had come to realize how black people and their contributions have been erased generally. And we were discovering black people doing all kinds of things. We were looking into Africa and African leaders, Kwame Nkrumah, others and others and others and others. So I knew about this process of marginalization and erasure. And as I went through grad school and all, I definitely had this thought, damn, only white people have said something important sociologically? There must be some of us somewhere that said something that was important. And so then I began to study Du Bois even more deeply. And I asked my dissertation chair, Lou Koza, I said, Professor Koza, we talking about Marx and Weber and Durkheim and Mannheim and Foucault and all of these folks. I said, why aren't we talking about Du Bois? He says, well, you know, that's because he was not a systematic thinker. He didn't have any real theories about what was going on and so forth. So I'm a beginning graduate student. So I got ready to like challenge him. And I said, oh, you better hold on a little bit. And I said to myself, one day I'm gonna set the record straight about Du Bois as a sociologist. And so I started to read and read more. I had written a long paper on Du Bois as the path not taken. And Zimmerman, I believe he's here at the conference. He got in touch with me. I sent him the paper because I read him, because he had talked about Du Bois as a theorist of religion, the pioneering theorist of religion. And so I had written this really long article on Du Bois, arguing about his was not the path taken in this, and we should take that path. And then he said to me, he said, do you know the work of Earl Wright? I said, no, I don't. And so he gave me some citations. And so I went and I read Earl Wright's work. And I read the works of many others, including a conference at the University of Chicago in the 70s where Du Bois was discussed and so forth. And so then I came, like most of the people of my generation, I came to Du Bois largely on my own. And so finally, with that long answer, let me just say that young Du Boisian scholars, Du Bois is legitimate now. There's work coming out everywhere. Read it. Also read deeply Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and all of them. Because the real payoff is to put Du Bois's voice and work in conversation with those who have been canonized before. So once again, to the young scholars, as I close, Godspeed. The work is ahead. Yes.
Well, Tom won't pick this up. So, one, I want to say thank you so much for the intentionality with the presentation, but reminding us that blackness is the reason.
Blackness is what?
Blackness is the reason
Okay.
for the continued fight, right? And us continuing to be where we are. And for me, I guess I'm trying to understand and ask for a motivational of advice, because when you're continuing to do research and do studies and you don't see philosophers in your course room text and your professors are not giving representations, and you have to be the one that continue to raise your hand in class and say, well, what about, it's exhausting, and you begin to overthink a little bit. Speaking for myself, I don't want to speak for everyone in the room. And I remember coming to this conference thinking, everybody keeps trying to tell me, don't just focus on the black people. That won't get you far in your research. And professors telling me, don't focus on that. And then I sit in this conference and seminar with you today at this morning, and all those thoughts left my mind. Because I was like, no, this is important. This is, and the reason why that, and maybe it's not malice, maybe it's programming, but the reason of the continued construct of do not have these conversations is because there is so much richness hidden in what they are trying to keep from us. And the moment that it comes to the surface, it is profound. And so I too am frustrated with our generation at this time. And as someone who's in a similar age category, can I be honest and share, it's very isolating as you're trying to talk about these topics and you have our people blinded by the majority of whiteness as an ideology being their liking and their keenness. I'm frustrated every day. I cry a lot, and I want to quit being a philosopher a lot. Sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. This really motivated me. And I just, I could use some advice on how to return back to this university and continue studying philosophy, but to continue, I'll give one example. I had a professor, data statistics analysis class, tell us, We need to focus on a topic that's so important. Focus on a topic that's so important. And I remember saying on a Zoom call with almost 50 students, I said, we need to talk about the disparities in the corporate America spaces with Black women. And we pull updated statistics, and it was 0.1% to 80% white men in leadership in comparison to Black women. And I said, so who's being represented in those C-suites? And I will never forget, my professor looked at me with an honest face and said, but that's an obvious data statistic, Shelby. We need to talk about something more. I said, have you ever been the 0.1%? Respectfully?
Gotcha.
And in that moment, it moved forward. And so the paper then was presented, and it was submitted, and I got an A on it. But it was a fight. He tried to get me to change the topic multiple times. And so I'm sorry for this elongated question, but I'm curious. I could use a little bit of just what advice would you give a young philosopher on her journey at this, on this degree path?
The first thing I would tell you is that you're not alone. That we got your back. We got email addresses. We got phone numbers. And you need to talk to us, we'll talk to you. So you're not alone. You're not as isolated as you think. That's one thing I would say. And I would say to scholars in the middle and scholars who are older, let us be mindful of reaching out to those who are coming behind us. There were those who grabbed us when we didn't know our way. So we got you. That's one thing. Second thing is that blackness or race is only one of the things. The important thing about Du Bois is that he looked at the total landscape. He asked the question about gender inequality, and he analyzed the nature of it and how it related to racial inequality. He analyzed class inequality and what is the relationship between class inequality and race. He asked the question, why do we have all these weapons of mass destruction? What is war really about? And he tied that back to racism and class inequality and gender inequality and became a major leader of the peace movement. So one of the things that I'm saying here is that Du Bois teaches us to be multidimensional in our scholarship. And it is true that we are, as a people, as universal as any people who've ever stepped on the planet. At the same time, we are part of humanity. And so we have to try to understand all of the different relationships, all of the fault lines and so on, and we speak to the world. And when we speak to the world, at some point the world will have to listen. That is why we're here with Du Bois, because Du Bois spoke to the world. Also, you know, one of the things that I did not mention in my talk, but it's central, Du Bois taught us that there is no big, unsurmountable barrier between scholarship and activism. Du Bois was one of the most prodigious scholars and intellectuals of the 20th century, but he was also one of the most prodigious activists of the 20th century, a founder of the Pan-African movement, a founder of the Niagara movement, a founder of the NAACP, and worked with the women's movement to help women get the franchise, publishing all kinds of articles in the Crisis about women and their oppression and so forth. And so I'm just saying two things. One, we got you. And two, is that let us be careful not to think that the only thing that matters in the world among human beings is just race or blackness. It's these multiple lines that crisscross and parallel and so forth, and we have to be concerned about that. So I'll just close with you by saying I appreciate hearing what you had to say, appreciate your pain. I've had my own share. But what do the old preachers say, you know, joy can cometh in the morning, right? So don't feel isolated, lean on us.
Hi, Dr. Morris.
Hi.
It's nice to meet you. I'm Christine Capelli. I want to say that your work has really resonated with me. I came into grad school not knowing too much about Du Bois, not learning too much about the sociology of race and ethnicity until we briefly talked about it in my classical theory class, just the souls of Black folk. But I had the opportunity to learn more about Du Bois through your work, through our grad seminar classes. And after taking those seminar classes, I moved forward in my program wanting to teach about critical race theory, and especially like to undergraduate students. And I've made sure to really center on Du Bois and race, moving beyond just talking about Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. And I just wanted to ask, like, how can we reach out to like undergraduate students in terms of like teaching and showing that there's more to like classical theory and that Du Bois should be centered in our conversations, especially with our conversations regarding like race and racism and like contemporary issues today.
Are you here at Brown?
No, I'm from the University of Oregon, so a predominantly white institution.
Yes. I ask that because, you know, with major Du Boisian scholars in the audience who've thought about these questions, you should certainly, if you've not read Itzig Zone and Brown's book, they talk about kind of how to carry forth a Du Boisian kind of scholarship and so on and so forth. Earl Wright has written a whole lot about pedagogy and Du Bois and so on. So, you know, one is to read those works and to assign at the undergraduate level, to assign those works. I think, okay, we have 5 minutes left.
Oh, sorry.
No. So I think it can be sometimes difficult to teach Du Bois at the undergraduate level.
Definitely.
But I tell you what, as many people here will tell you, first thing you assign to them is souls of Black folk.
Yes,
And
definitely do.
And it generally catches them and, you know, captivates them. But I think that it's very important to show how Du Bois's ideas are relevant to their lives and to the experiences that they are having, so that if you think about intersectionality, Du Bois, in a sense, anticipated it, or critical race theory and so forth. So I think that you ask, especially if it's all white, you ask them, what does it mean to be white? And you say, okay, let's go read The Souls of White Folk by Du Bois. You know, what does it mean to be well off amidst massive poverty? And you go and you read Du Bois speaking to those kinds of issues. So I think that what you have to do is to, as you read and so forth, you ask yourself the question, how can I make this palatable for undergraduates, for young people? And the important thing is that Du Bois always cared about young people. You know, I don't think Karita is here, but she wrote a book about Du Bois, writing a book, a journal thing called the Brownie books. And it was all about kids, Black kids, and what they were going through, and all of this, how they felt about themselves, ashamed of themselves and stuff. And so Du Bois was very focused on the role of young people. And so I think you can bring them in through that avenue.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So I think we're out of time, right? Thank you. Loved it.